The year was 1870. In a busy Buenos Aires port, an older German fellow who was in his 50s was confused and alone, with nothing but a small bag and a suitcase to keep him company. He strolled down the streets for half of the day, until he found a tavern. Stein, the place was called. Perhaps he recognized it as the German word for rock, and perhaps that's why he went inside. In Stein is where he made his first contacts in the South. He found other Germans like him and trusted them enough to share the reasons he had left Europe. He also showed them his only treasure and hope. Inside his old suitcase, he stored his precious bandoneon. The instrument was a novelty back then. There were few others in the world. This particular bandoneon had all its wooden parts made of ebony, painted in striking shades of black and red. The German was a luthier, and he made his prized bandoneon from scratch. His plan was to start a factory, a brand, an empire, a dynasty. Leo Fender may have thought, planned, and hoped for the same things back in the day. And here's the thing. He was so in love with his creation and his dream that he put everything he had into them. Not only did he invest his mental energy, but also his earthly possessions. He sold everything he had to make the trip from Germany to South America and a little further. The handles of the instrument were made of solid gold, and he was so proud, so enamored, that he could not stop talking about his bandoneon. He lasted a week, living at that godforsaken tavern. Every day he would go out into the city looking for other Germans to try and convince them to invest in his dream company. It didn't go well. In the nights, he would go back to the tavern, eat a mediocre meal, and sleep in a dirty, cheap room in the back of the building. But before retiring to his bed, he would take the time to show the bandoneon to the patrons and maybe play a little tune for them. And of course, he would brag about what he had in mind and how rich he was going to become selling his luxury instruments to the world. The right person never listened, but the wrong one did. The German died on his 8th night in the city. He had a stroke. He was found tied to his bed by his ankles and wrists. Someone ambushed him, maybe in his sleep. At his feet, the bandoneon sat broken into several pieces, a shadow of what it once was. The handles were nowhere to be seen, but everything else was there. It was as if someone had carefully used a hammer to dismantle the instrument piece by piece, making sure not to destroy the wood or the buttons in their attempt to remove the handles. It was obvious that this had all happened in front of the German. The perpetrator was never found, but the handles were, a few days later. That's how it started. The legend. The legend of the instrument I now have in my possession. That's the legend of how it came to be. In the music world, there are many legends about great musicians making pacts with dark forces in order to create the art that made them famous. Tango is no exception. The first documented owner of the Ebony Bandoneon was a man named Agamemnon Lanza, a lowly criminal with a strange reputation in the city. He was in his 40s and could play that instrument well enough, but he wanted to be a musical genius. He made a name for himself at some parties where bottles ended up flying and knives shone under candlelight in the worst neighborhoods where whores and thieves were common, and the few honest folk were trapped in poverty with them. Like many others in his position, Agamemnon Lanza wanted a record deal. He dreamt of his music invading every home in Buenos Aires, making men and women dance in the dark, forcing tears out of the eyes of the strongest men moved by his music. But he wasn't that good. Or at least, according to the legend, that's what he thought of himself. One night, after a party, after he finished playing his bandoneon, Lanza met a young woman. She had moved to the area a few months earlier from the north of the country, from a province named Corrientes. They talked in the street for a while after everyone else had left. He talked about his passion and his art, about his desires and his insecurities. Despite sharing so much, he was still guarded so as not to show too much, but the girl was smart enough to see beyond what his words implied. So she told him about her uncle, a curandero, a mystic healer, and how he could help him achieve his goals, for a price. Agamemnon Lanza found that price cheap. She just wanted enough money to buy 2, maybe 3 meals. He tentatively accepted. The three of them met a couple days later at a popular fishing spot on the shores of Rio de la Plata. Then the healer told Lanza everything they would need: 5 black candles, salt, a mirror, iron will, and the bandoneon itself. They would meet the next night at a crossroad in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The devil would come grant Lanza's wish for a price. Lanza didn't even flinch. According to the legend, he had killed, tortured, and raped. He was already condemned to hell, so how could a pact with the devil make anything worse? Just like most people in South America, Lanza believed in God and the devil, but he wasn't scared. And so, the next night, Agamemnon Lanza met with the healer and the girl at the crossroads. After beginning the ritual, the older man summoned, not the devil, but 4 thugs. The girl asked Lanza a question. "Do you remember Juana Aristegui? Do you remember what you did to her? She was my cousin." The 5 men beat Lanza within an inch of his life and stole his bandoneon. The Ebony Bandoneon appeared again in the hands of a small-time musician named Roberto Gonzalez. He wasn't particularly talented, or even punctual. He was about to be fired from the small tango orchestra he played with. He was too much of a drunk, and sometimes he didn't even show up to parties. And most of the time, when he did make it to his job, other members of the orchestra had to pull him onto the stage and give him his instrument. Otherwise, he would try to hit on the women at the party, if he didn't fall to the floor first. The singer in that orchestra got some fame, enough to land him a deal in the Buenos Aires of old, and so all the musicians went to the studio to record what they thought would be a massive hit. Just 1 song. That was all they needed. Funny, what artist hasn't thought something similar at some point in their career? The day of the recording session dawned in gray on the shores of Rio de la Plata. The distant sound of thunder kept the crew company while they waited for Gonzalez to finally join them. Which he did, an hour later, trembling, dragging the suitcase with the bandoneon behind him, stumbling with every step threatening to send him falling. It seemed this was his natural state, since he managed to reach his coworkers without taking a nap on the concrete first. The crew, used to his antics, took him to the bathroom, cleaned his face a little, gave him some coffee, and prayed that he'd be able to open his eyes enough to read the score. God may have answered their prayers, or someone's prayers. The song was beautiful. The orchestra managed to record it with little trouble, even with a drunk musician. It took them several hours, but they were confident that they had something good on their hands. It wouldn't take long before the few radio stations in Buenos Aires and Montevideo could start bringing their work to the radio waves. When the musicians were almost ready to go, the engineer went to them, running, scared. "There's a storm out there," he said, "and it is swallowing the city." Intrigued, the musicians went up the stairs to the first floor. They found water advancing, flowing from below the door, slowly making its way toward the basement. The thunder outside roared as if Buenos Aires was being bombed. They could hear the pouring rain whipping the streets, the cars and the few unfortunate that were taken by surprise, desperately trying to find safety. Everyone ran, took their things and tried to leave. Nobody even tried to wake up Roberto Gonzalez, who had fallen asleep soon after they finished recording. Once they got to the door, they found it locked from the outside. Something was blocking the keyhole and they couldn't clear it. The water reached their ankles now, and they could not open the door. Their knees, and they could not open the door. Their waists, and they could not open the door. Their chests. At this point, they didn't even try with the door. The windows in the building didn't break, no matter how much they threw at them or how many times they punched the glass. The engineer fainted. He woke up on the roof of the building, alongside Roberto Gonzalez, who was hugging his bandoneon case, slowly rocking back and forth as if he was cradling a newborn. The engineer asked about the other men. Gonzalez grinned, but didn't answer. Roberto Gonzalez reappeared with the Ebony Bandoneon a decade later, and it was hard to recognize him. He was clean. He had not drank a single drop of alcohol in years, and he was ready to resume his career as a musician. Old acquaintances were skeptical, of course, but someone eventually gave him a chance. Just one chance. And Gonzalez used his one shot well. He played in a small orchestra that frequented the less popular parties, and his bandoneon sounded flawless. He was never a second late. He never participated in the regular arguments that sparked between the musicians. He was a model worker, and that attitude landed him with another gig, with another orchestra, playing in bigger places for larger audiences. His attitude landed him in the hands of several employers, every time in a better position than the last. A year after his comeback, he was playing for 500 people 3 nights a week, and making enough money to live with a modest degree of comfort. On Saturdays, he played at the Vernon, long before it was the 5-star hotel it is now. Back then, it was a neighborhood club used for several purposes, including ballroom parties. That night, when the orchestra was playing their 3rd song, and the dance floor was filled with as many couples as possible, Roberto Gonzalez was unusually inspired. At some point, he started improvising. If the year had been 1990, and if his bandoneon had been an electric guitar, critics would have written about that performance in the Great Book of Music Tour de Force. But it wasn't 1990, and all the music did was confuse the dancers. A scold from the singer later, they were ready to start the 4th song. They did not. Someone yelled. It took the musicians a few seconds, but they deciphered the word, disfigured by fear. Fire. The next day, local newspapers would report an accident, but survivors said someone intentionally lit the curtains on fire. The tongues of flames licked the fabric until they reached the ceiling, and then it was too late. The fires engulfed the building faster than seems possible. People barely had time to escape. Those who managed to escape anyway. 114 people died in minutes, including most members of the orchestra. The firefighters worked 10 hours to put out the fire. Some people just disappeared, their bodies never to be found. And the next morning, in an alley in the other end of the city, Roberto Gonzalez was found wearing his dirty clothes, smelling like smoke, bruised and confused, hugging his bandoneon, repeating one sentence over and over again. It follows us. It follows us. It follows us. It took another 12 years for Roberto Gonzalez to appear in Buenos Aires' musical scene again. Where he had been and what he was doing wasn't anyone's business. Most people had forgotten about him, so starting over again was a problem, but he managed to get a job in a small academy in La Boca neighborhood, teaching some youngsters how to play guitar, how to sing, how to follow a rhythm. For some time, everything was fine. As fine as it could be for a music teacher in his 50s with nothing to his name. He lived alone in a small room somewhere in the city. Every morning, he was up at 6 o'clock, walked several blocks to the academy, taught the kids a few hours, went to a nearby public park to eat something, saw the hours of his life go by in front of his eyes, taught for a few more hours, and then walked back to his room. But he was competent with the guitar, and with some effort he earned the respect of his colleagues. Some of them, at least. Others were a little worried, maybe, about some of the things they had seen. The most common complaint was his rambling. Sometimes some people could hear him talking to himself, refusing something in a whisper. And a few others heard him in the park, almost yelling the same words over and over again. "No, I won't. Go away. Leave me alone." And I didn't do it. The people in charge of the administration didn't care too much, and gradually they gave him more and more work to do. There wasn't a promotion, but promises of a raise, and that was usually enough. Gonzalez accepted his new responsibilities and went on with his work, and this eased the complaints. The more work he got done, the less he rambled, until there was no rambling anymore, so he looked, at least on the surface, a well-adjusted citizen. Poor fools. About a year after he started working with the kids, there was a presentation for the parents. The academy's director wanted a full show with several instruments. He knew Roberto Gonzalez could play a bandoneon, so he ordered him to prepare a song, a very specific song on the bandoneon. And he wasn't taking no for an answer. A potential investor would be present. Gonzalez refused, but it didn't matter. When the day finally came, he had to be present, with the only bandoneon he could get, the Ebony Bandoneon. Everything went according to plan, up until almost the end. The musicians were closing their act with the song the director had asked for. Once the second chord sounded, something exploded inside the walls. Half a heartbeat later, the bricks gave into the pressure. A water pipe had broken. Soon, everyone had water above their knees. Gonzalez panicked and ran away, carrying the bandoneon with him. People, confused, just stared at him. Then they started to leave the room, slowly, in an ordered fashion. That may have been their greatest mistake. Something else broke inside the walls. Something else escaped from the bricks. Electrical cables somehow made contact with the water. The room became a death trap. 22 people died that day, electrocuted. Some of them as young as 8. The last time Roberto Gonzalez appeared, the world had changed. A lot. He was in his 70s, beaten by life, lost and alone, homeless, living around the port of Buenos Aires, eating food found in the dumpsters. He wore the same battered, dirty clothes for about 3 years. Nevertheless, he still carried the Ebony Bandoneon. Both the case and the instrument were well cared for. There wasn't a scratch on either of them. Somehow, the man managed to protect the damn thing against the elements and other dangers in the urban hellhole he dwelled in. Someone in the streets took pity on him and managed to get him in a bed in a nursing home. Ramblings were almost the only thing that came out of his mouth. But in all fairness, he still had some lucid moments several times a day. He liked to take a chair to the backyard and sit next to a tree, watching things in the distance. Or maybe he was watching the ghosts of his past, of his own life, devoured by time, tainted by the horrors we know about, and those that we don't. The other people living there, the staff, and sometimes relatives in a long visit, would ask him from time to time to play something on his bandoneon. He refused. That is, the times he actually gave anything resembling an answer. Most of the time it was as if nobody even spoke to him. Most of the time his face was disfigured in a half-smile. The staff believed that he was just happy about having a roof over his head and several meals a day. 6 months after he was admitted, a member of staff noticed Gonzalez had lost weight. The trend continued, so a doctor saw him and ran several tests. In his few lucid moments, with a calm and firm voice, he told them it was useless. They wouldn't find anything wrong with him. He knew what was wrong, and he knew why it happened, and even how to stop it. But he wouldn't do whatever that was. "I'm old," he said. "My time is almost up. I don't need to be selfish again." The tests revealed nothing. He was as healthy as a man his age could be. The staff was baffled, but what could they have done? Day after day, Gonzalez was thinner, skinnier, and happier. Then, one day, on a morning when he was exceptionally lucid, he asked an orderly to help to carry a chair and the bandoneon to the tree in the backyard, and then to leave him alone for some time, which the man did. A nurse found him about an hour later, dead, with the instrument on his lap and a smile on his face. She said she was working next to the door and never heard one single note. Nevertheless, it looked as if he was playing when he died. There is one more page in this book. I finally found something else about the luthier that made the Ebony Bandoneon, the German. Stein, the bar where he stayed, is still open to this day, and has been kept in the family for generations. I managed to interview a great whatever son of the original owner. The crime committed in the bar was, of course, part of the family mythology, along with the stories about the English-Argentine brother-in-law who joined the Allies in World War II, and the Nazi sympathizer uncle who joined the Axis. The luthier told them the story of the bandoneon several times before his death. What is truth and what's part of this family's folklore is, at this point, impossible to tell apart. The German was a robber back in Europe, a grave robber. He didn't come to South America with the intention of finding any type of promised land for immigrants, no. He came to escape his own past. In the nights, he would unearth coffins, open them, and steal any jewelry he could find. One finding could make him enough money to get by for months. He did this for several years, to the point he could have lived for about a decade with the money he had already made. But it is never enough, is it? When he first made the bandoneon, he decided he wanted something luxurious. Golden handles. He had the money to order them, but that wasn't his style. Why pay for what you can steal? And so began the week. Every night he would go to the cemetery, pick the oldest-looking graves, and dig. He wasn't a young man anymore, but that never stopped him. Just slowed him down. And on the 7th night, slowed him down enough to be caught. A young woman found him and demanded he leave. He threatened to kill her with his shovel if she didn't let him be. He was going to make something great with the jewelry after all, and the dead have no needs. In a few words, the girl cursed the jewels he found, and warned him, no matter what he tried to do, if the jewels left the grave, they would always attract broken people, and tragedies would follow. The man wasn't taking any of her nonsense, so he beat her with the shovel. According to the story, she lived. Then he melted all the jewelry and used the gold to make the bandoneon's handles, and left Europe. You know the rest of the story. I thanked the people in the bar and came back home to write down all of this. I keep staring at the damn ebony bandoneon I bought for pennies at a secondhand store. I don't even play the instrument, I'm just a dancer. And I can't stop thinking, how am I broken? And worse, why do I keep hearing this melody in my head? This melody in 2x4 beat. This melancholic sound, this echo of griefs long past? And why do I feel as if I could take that bandoneon and play that tune to perfection right now?
For another story, tune in next Tuesday. Meanwhile, watch another video. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Check the description for our social media. And sleep well.
If you can.